Captain Planet and the Planeteers was created by a billionaire, not a creative director, not an animation veteran, not a writer with a vision, a billionaire named Ted Turner who had built CNN from nothing and who in 1990 decided that the most powerful thing he could do with his money and his platform was create a cartoon about saving the planet. Turner did not hand the concept to a development team and walk away. He was personally involved in the ideology of the show. He had opinions about the villains. He had opinions about the message. He had opinions about what children in 1990 needed to hear, and he was willing to spend real money making sure they heard it. The result was one of the most openly political cartoons ever produced for American children, and one of the most fascinating case studies in what happens when a show is built entirely around a message, rather than around the characters who are supposed to carry it. Captain Planet did not fail because its ideas were wrong. It failed because the people who made it never figured out how to make you care about the people on screen before they started telling you what to think. To understand why Captain Planet landed the way it did, you have to understand the specific moment in history it was born into. In 1990, environmental anxiety was not a fringe concern. The ozone layer was actively depleting. The Exxon Valdez oil spill had happened the previous year, and the images from it had circulated through every television in America. Rainforest destruction was being reported in mainstream news as an ongoing emergency rather than a distant abstraction. There was a genuine and widespread feeling among adults that the planet was in trouble, and a corresponding guilt about what that meant for the children who would inherit the consequences. Ted Turner looked at that cultural moment and saw an opportunity not for profit but for influence. He wanted to use the reach of his network to shift the values of an entire generation before that generation was old enough to vote. The mythology Turner and his creative team built around this intention was straightforward in its structure and genuinely global in its ambition. 5 teenagers from 5 different continents each received a ring from Gaia, the spirit of the earth. Kwame from Africa controlled earth. Wheeler from North America controlled fire. Linka from the Soviet Union controlled wind. Guy from Asia controlled water. Meitai from South America controlled heart, which was consistently the most mocked power in the lineup, and also secretly the most important one, because without heart the team could not combine their rings to summon Captain Planet himself. When the 5 powers combined, a blue-skinned, green-haired superhero emerged from the combination who could fly and move water and reshape terrain and deliver a closing speech about environmental responsibility before vanishing back into the rings until the next episode needed him. The villain roster was where the show revealed its ideological priorities most directly, and where it also created its most significant creative problem. The Planeteers faced a rotating gallery of eco-villains, each representing a different category of environmental destruction. Hoggish Greedly was corporate greed and overconsumption. Verminous Scum was pollution and drug abuse. Luton Plunder was exploitation and illegal trade. Sly Sludge was illegal dumping. Duke Nukem was nuclear contamination. Dr. Blight was the corruption of science for destructive ends. Each villain was visually grotesque and morally uncomplicated. They were not people with reasons. They were symbols of specific wrongs, and the show's relationship with them was entirely allegorical rather than dramatic. You never once wondered what Hoggish Greedly wanted beyond more of everything, or why Luton Plunder had chosen the life he led. They existed to be defeated, and their defeat was meant to represent the defeat of the real-world behaviors they symbolized. This was the central miscalculation that Captain Planet never recovered from. A cartoon can carry a message. Some of the best cartoons ever made carry messages that last a lifetime. But a message requires characters to move through it, and characters require specificity and contradiction, and the capacity for surprise to feel like people rather than placards. The Planeteers were better developed than the villains, but they were still defined primarily by their elemental powers and their geographic origins rather than by interior lives that existed independently of their environmental mission. Wheeler the American was impulsive and frequently wrong and occasionally brave in ways that felt accidental. Linka was serious and occasionally condescending and carried a grief about her home country that the show introduced and then handled inconsistently. Quam was calm and deliberate and dignified, and the show treated him with genuine respect, which made it more painful that he was also the least surprising character in every episode he appeared in. Guy was enthusiastic and technically capable, and should have been more central to a show about science and ecological systems than the writing ever allowed her to be. Meitai was gentle and underestimated, and the show used his underestimation as a recurring device, without ever fully resolving what it meant that the power of heart was consistently treated as lesser by everyone, including the show itself. These were not personalities built from the inside out. They were character types, assembled to represent demographic diversity and assigned elemental abilities and then placed into situations that required them to behave consistently with their types, rather than to surprise you with who they actually were. The show understood this problem intermittently and tried to address it in specific episodes that pushed the characters into more genuinely dramatic territory. There were episodes dealing with drug addiction that were more direct and more uncomfortable than anything else on afternoon television in the early 1990s. There were episodes exploring apartheid and racial violence and famine that took real risks with content that most children's programmers would have refused to touch. In these moments, Captain Planet demonstrated that the creative team was capable of something more than illustrated lesson plans. The ambition was real. The willingness to address serious subjects without softening them was real. The problem was that these episodes required the characters to have depth that the show had not consistently established. And so the emotional weight they were reaching for had nowhere to land because the audience had not been given enough reason to care about these specific people facing these specific things. The animation reinforced the show's weaknesses rather than compensating for them. DIC Entertainment, which produced the first 5 seasons, worked to a budget that kept the visual quality uneven and often disappointing in ways that mattered most. The character movements were frequently stiff in the way that limited television animation always risks being stiff. But Captain Planet had chosen a premise where visual spectacle was not optional. It was the promise the show made to every child who sat down to watch it. A hero who can control wind and water and earth and fire and the combined forces of nature itself should be visually extraordinary when he finally appears. He should make the screen feel like it cannot contain him. Captain Planet frequently looked like someone running in place in front of a moving background, and children who could not have named the problem could absolutely feel it. The gap between what the concept promised and what the animation delivered was wide enough that it became its own kind of lesson about the distance between ambition and execution, a lesson the show had not intended to teach. Ted Turner's direct involvement in the show's content created an additional tension that shaped everything from episode selection to villain design. Turner had strong views about nuclear power that the show reflected in its treatment of Duke Nukem and nuclear energy generally. He had strong views about corporate behavior that shaped loot and plunder and hoggish greedily. He had strong views about the Soviet Union that complicated Linka's character in ways the writers navigated awkwardly, particularly after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 and Linka's backstory suddenly needed to account for a country that no longer existed. The ideological fingerprints of one man's worldview were visible on every episode, and while Turner's environmental concerns were legitimate and his willingness to act on them was genuine, the show suffered from the same problem that all art suffers when it is too directly controlled by the beliefs of a single patron. It argued rather than explored. It concluded before it had earned the right to conclude. The ratings across the early seasons were strong enough to keep the show running, and Turner's commitment to the project meant that cancellation was never a serious threat while he remained invested in it. The show ran for 6 seasons from 1990 to 1996, which by the standards of the era was a substantial run. A 5th season brought in Hanna-Barbera to take over production from DIC, and the visual quality improved noticeably in those final episodes. The writing in the later seasons also showed more willingness to develop the Planeteers as individuals rather than simply as representatives of their respective elements and continents. But by this point, the cultural conversation had moved, and children who had been the target audience in 1990 had aged out entirely, while the show had never successfully recruited the generation behind. The legacy of Captain Planet is genuinely complicated in ways that the show itself was not. The people who grew up watching it largely remember it with affection that exists alongside a clear-eyed acknowledgement of its flaws. The theme song is remembered. Captain Planet's catchphrase is remembered. The idea that 5 teenagers from different parts of the world could combine their individual powers into something greater than any of them could manage alone is remembered, and it is a genuinely good idea that the show never fully delivered on, but that stayed in the minds of the children who absorbed it anyway. There's a generation of environmental advocates and policy professionals who will tell you without irony that Captain Planet was part of what made them care about the planet before they were old enough to do anything about it. That the show was clumsy and preachy and visually disappointing does not cancel out the fact that it was also the only thing on television in 1990 that was talking to children about the world they were going to inherit and asking them to take it seriously. What destroyed Captain Planet was not opposition. It was not a culture that rejected its message or a network that pulled it before its time. It was not even the budget constraints or the rotating writing staff or the production inconsistencies that plagued it across 6 seasons. What destroyed it was something quieter and more fundamental than any of those things. It was the assumption that caring about the right things is sufficient to make something good. It is not. Caring about the right things gives you the reason to make something, and that reason matters and should not be dismissed. But the craft required to make it matter to someone who does not already agree with you is a completely separate problem, and one that requires a different set of skills and a different kind of patience than ideological conviction alone can provide. Captain Planet knew what it believed before it knew who it was. And a show that knows what it believes before it knows who it is will always preach before it can move you. The planet needed a better show. It almost got one. The gap between those two things is where the entire story lives, and where it has lived for 30 years without anyone fully closing it.